Gary would say, well, he's on a 12-year scholarship to the University of Outer Mongolia.
One day, he was there, towering over Richie Cunningham, basketball in hand, cracking casual one-liners at the dinner table. And then, without warning, he was gone. No goodbye, no explanation, not even a passing mention. It was as if Richie's older brother, Chuck, had never existed at all. For decades, fans have wondered, how does a family member vanish from one of television's biggest sitcoms without a trace? If you tuned into the first season or two of Happy Days back in the mid-1970s, you would have known Chuck as the eldest Cunningham sibling. He was the tall, easygoing college basketball player who would drop by the house, raid the fridge, and deliver a quick, casual wave before heading upstairs to study. He was not a central character, but his presence rounded out the family dynamic. He was a subtle but consistent part of the show's early structure. And then, gone. Not off to join the army, not transferred to a college out of state, not working overseas, just gone. In later seasons, the Cunninghams behaved as if Richie had only one sibling, his sister, Joni. There was no grieving, no adjusting, no acknowledgement. Even in the final episode, patriarch Howard Cunningham spoke of having 2 children, completely omitting any trace of his oldest son. For years, viewers shrugged it off, assuming maybe they missed an episode or two that explained it. But there was no missing episode, no hidden script in the archives. Chuck Cunningham had simply vanished without a trace, both in the fictional world of Happy Days and in the real-life narrative behind the scenes. The oddity became so infamous that it sparked its own pop culture term, Chuck Cunningham syndrome, the phenomenon where a television character disappears without explanation, as though they never existed. And yet, while fans have been fascinated by the mystery for decades, even cast members have joked about how baffling it really was. In August of 2025, Henry Winkler, the legendary Fonzie himself, posted a wry reminder on social media. He went upstairs and never came down. A mystery. It was a wink to fans, a confirmation that yes, the disappearance was as strange to the people making the show as it was to the audience watching it. But beneath the jokes and the decades of fan theories lies a surprisingly layered story, one that involves creative decisions, behind-the-scenes frustrations, shifting priorities, and perhaps even a quiet television experiment. The mystery of Chuck Cunningham's vanishing act did not just change the cast lineup, it reshaped Happy Days in ways no one could have predicted. And the first twist in that story? The actor playing Chuck decided he wanted out. When Happy Days premiered in 1974, Chuck Cunningham was played by Gavin O'Herlihy, an Irish-born actor with a tall frame, easy smile, and the perfect look for a laid-back college athlete. At first glance, the role seemed like a promising recurring gig. He was part of a hit new sitcom set in an idealized 1950s America, created by Gary Marshall and backed by a strong ensemble cast. But O'Herlihy quickly realized that Chuck was not going to be a breakout character, far from it. In interviews years later, O'Herlihy explained that he found the role painfully underwritten. His character rarely had more than a few lines per episode, and those lines often boiled down to a single joke or a quick nod to his basketball career. He once described his work on the show as little more than grunt, bounce a basketball, and leave. For an ambitious young actor eager to stretch his talents, that was hardly satisfying. Behind the scenes, O'Herlihy had ambitions to take on more serious work, especially in film. He had already appeared in a few movies before Happy Days and was confident he could land more interesting roles. He saw the writing on the wall. Chuck was never going to evolve into a complex, memorable part of the show. If anything, the spotlight was shifting away from the Cunningham family entirely and toward another character, a leather-jacketed mechanic who was rapidly becoming a cultural icon. So, midway through the second season, O'Herlihy made the bold decision to leave. This was not a case of being fired or pushed out. By all accounts, he simply did not want to spend more time playing a character he felt had no future. For an actor in his 20s, walking away from a popular television series was risky. But O'Herlihy did not hesitate. He even turned down offers to return later, once the show was more established, firmly closing the door on Chuck Cunningham. For the production team, the exit created an immediate problem. Chuck might have been a minor character, but he was still part of the show's family dynamic. You could not just remove the eldest Cunningham without some sort of replacement, or could you? At the time, television continuity was looser, and audiences were less likely to demand airtight explanations for every character change. Still, the producers were not ready to erase Chuck entirely, at least not yet. They tried one last move to keep him in the picture, but the result would only make his disappearance even more famous. After Gavin O'Herlihy's departure, the producers were not ready to completely abandon Chuck Cunningham, at least not immediately. Instead, they quietly recast the role, bringing in actor Randolph Roberts to step into the part for the remainder of Season 2. The swap was made without any on-screen explanation, a common practice at the time. Viewers simply tuned in 1 week and found a new face sitting at the Cunningham family table, introduced with no fanfare. Roberts's version of Chuck kept the same general traits: a basketball-playing college student who popped in for short, casual scenes before heading upstairs or out the door. But if O'Herlihy had felt the role was underdeveloped, Roberts quickly found himself in the same boat. His Chuck appeared in only 2 episodes, each time delivering brief, functional dialogue that did little to flesh out his personality. There were no major storylines, no defining character moments, just fleeting appearances that almost felt like a courtesy to keep him on the roster. And then, just as suddenly as he arrived, Roberts's Chuck was gone. After his final appearance, the eldest Cunningham sibling simply ceased to exist in the Happy Days universe. No character mentioned him again. No scene hinted at his whereabouts. Even in moments when a family gathering might have made sense for him to attend, graduations, milestones, or emotional episodes, Chuck was nowhere to be found. It was as though the show's writers had collectively decided he had never been part of the family in the first place. This abrupt erasure was not just unusual, it was glaring. Television in the 1970s often swapped actors, wrote characters out, or shifted focus without heavy explanation, but rarely did a family member disappear entirely with zero acknowledgement. The lack of resolution left a strange gap in the show's continuity. Richie and Joni continued as if they had always been the only Cunningham children, while viewers who remembered Chuck were left scratching their heads. That bizarre handling of Chuck's exit would later earn a special place in television lore, becoming shorthand for any character who vanishes without explanation. But at the time, the move was less about creating a legendary mystery and more about responding to changing priorities within the show itself, a shift that would completely redefine Happy Days and, ironically, make Chuck's absence easier for audiences to accept. Because just as Chuck was being erased, another character was stepping up to fill the older brother role in a way no one could have predicted. By the early 1980s, television critics and longtime viewers had given a name to what happened to Chuck Cunningham, a term that would outlive both the character and the show itself: Chuck Cunningham syndrome. It became the go-to shorthand for any situation in which a character simply disappears from a television series without explanation, never to be seen or mentioned again, as though they had been wiped from the show's history. The phrase was coined because Chuck's removal was not just casual. It was so complete, so deliberate, that it effectively rewrote the Happy Days universe in real time. Yes, other television shows had dropped characters before. A recurring neighbor might suddenly move away. A colleague might quietly leave a workplace sitcom, or a minor background figure might simply stop showing up. But Chuck's disappearance stood out because of how crucial his role theoretically should have been. He was not a background extra. He was not a friend of a friend whose absence could be brushed off. He was the eldest child in the Cunningham family, the very family at the center of the show. That fact alone made the silence surrounding his exit feel strange, even unsettling, to anyone who noticed. This was not just a casting change, it was a narrative vanishing act, and the writers doubled down on it in a way that seemed intentional. Fans who continued watching after Chuck's exit began to realize just how completely the show avoided even the smallest reference to him. It was not a matter of, "Oh, Chuck is away at school," or "Chuck's off traveling." It was as if Chuck had never been born. By the later seasons, Howard and Marion Cunningham would openly discuss their children, but they would only name Richie and Joni. even in warm, sentimental episodes that looked back on the family's past, prime opportunities for a nostalgic nod to an absent sibling, Chuck was nowhere to be found. The final season offered perhaps the most definitive erasure. In the series finale, Howard refers to having 2 kids, not 3. In that moment, any lingering hope of Chuck's return was quietly, permanently buried. The phenomenon fascinated pop culture writers. Once the term Chuck Cunningham syndrome took hold, it began popping up everywhere in television criticism. Entertainment journalists and fans alike would use it to label similar disappearances in other shows. Judy Winslow from Family Matters vanished mid-series without a goodbye. Minkus from Boy Meets World gone without a trace after the first season. Even shows like The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air had characters who quietly exited, and critics pointed back to Happy Days as the definitive textbook example of the trope. As the years passed, the syndrome became part of the broader television lexicon. It was not just about missing characters, it was about what their absence revealed, that sitcom audiences of the time were surprisingly willing to accept gaping continuity holes if the rest of the show kept them entertained. This was a sharp contrast to the modern era, where online fan communities dissect every plot point and demand explanations for even the smallest inconsistencies. Back then, a character could simply vanish, and within a few weeks, many viewers would have moved on without a second thought. Still, the legend around Chuck's disappearance made it seem like there was some deep, shadowy reason for his absence. A messy, behind-the-scenes feud, a shocking scandal, or a contractual battle that forced the writers to erase him from memory. But the truth was far less sensational. Chuck's removal was equal parts creative choice, audience preference, and a casual experiment by the show's creator in just how much they could change without losing viewers. And there was one factor above all that made the erasure work. A single character was becoming so wildly popular that he didn't just replace Chuck. He made audiences forget Chuck had ever been there in the first place. When Happy Days premiered, the show was built around the Cunningham family and their wholesome middle American life. Richie was the central character, Joni the kid sister, Chuck the older brother, and Howard and Marion the warm but slightly old-fashioned parents. But as the series found its rhythm, another character began to steal the spotlight. Arthur Fonzarelli, better known as Fonzie. Originally intended as a cool secondary character, Fonzie was supposed to pop in for comic relief, or to serve as a contrast to Richie's clean-cut nature. Henry Winkler played him with such effortless charm, however, that audiences could not get enough. By the end of the first season, fan mail was pouring in for Fonzie. Viewers tuned in not just for Richie's adventures, but to see what Fonzie would do next. He had the swagger, the catchphrases, and the kind of magnetic presence that sitcom producers dream of. This sudden surge in popularity had ripple effects. Fonzie began appearing in more episodes, often as Richie's guide, protector, or partner in mischief. Slowly, he started occupying the narrative space that an old brother like Chuck might have filled. Need advice about girls? Fonzie would give it. Need backup in a tricky situation? Fonzie was there. In a way, he became Richie's big brother without ever being related to him. Gary Marshall, the show's creator, noticed the chemistry between Winkler and Ron Howard. Their banter felt authentic, their scenes together were lively, and most importantly, audiences loved them. So rather than fight against the natural pull toward Fonzie, the writers leaned into it. Chuck, a character without much development or a defined purpose, became less and less necessary. Why keep him around when Fonzie could do everything Chuck was meant to do, and do it better? As Fonzie's popularity exploded, the shift in focus was impossible to miss. He moved from being a background figure in a leather jacket to sharing top billing with Richie. In later seasons, he was arguably the show's true star. Merchandise featured him, storylines revolved around him, and his cultural influence was so strong that Happy Days itself seemed to reshape around him. By the time Chuck disappeared entirely, audiences were so wrapped up in the Richie-Fonzie dynamic that they barely looked back. What had started as a subtle casting change became a complete realignment of the show's center of gravity. Fonzie had not just replaced Chuck in the narrative, he had erased him from the audience's memory. But Gary Marshall later admitted there was more to the decision than simply following audience preferences. In his mind, Chuck's disappearance was also an intentional creative experiment. Years after Happy Days cemented itself as one of television's most beloved sitcoms, creator Gary Marshall finally spoke more openly about Chuck Cunningham's strange disappearance. According to Marshall, the move was not just a matter of dropping an underused character, it was also a deliberate test of audience attention. He wanted to see if viewers would even notice. Marshall's thinking reflected the era's looser approach to continuity. In 1970s sitcoms, audiences were accustomed to sudden changes. Sets could be redecorated overnight, minor characters might vanish without a word, and even actors could be swapped out mid-season with no on-screen explanation. If viewers liked the new dynamic, the show moved forward without looking back. Chuck was simply the most extreme example. In one interview, Marshall compared the decision to an earlier incident from the George Burns and Gracie Allen show, where an actor was replaced without comment, and audiences quickly adapted. In his mind, if a sibling in a family sitcom quietly vanished, fans would be so focused on the stories at hand that they would accept the new reality without demanding answers. And, astonishingly, that is exactly what happened. While a few fans wrote letters in the early days asking where Chuck went, there was no public outcry. Ratings stayed strong, and the chemistry between Richie and Fonzie continued to carry the show. In effect, Marshall's experiment worked. Not only did the audience accept Chuck's absence, but many casual viewers eventually forgot he had been there at all. This outcome confirmed something Marshall and the writers suspected. If a character is not deeply woven into a show's emotional core, they can be removed with minimal disruption, especially if another character fills their role more effectively. Chuck had been a background player from the start, so when Fonzie stepped into the older brother slot in Richie's life, the loss felt natural, even seamless. But while the creative team moved on, the story of Chuck's vanishing act took on a life of its own. Fans who remembered him turned the mystery into a running joke, and television critics turned it into a cautionary tale about underdeveloped characters. The decision might have been calculated, but its legacy would prove far bigger than Marshall ever imagined. And as the years passed, Chuck's absence stopped being just a quirky piece of Happy Days trivia. It became a full-fledged pop culture phenomenon. Chuck Cunningham's disappearance might have begun as a small behind-the-scenes decision, but over time it became one of the most enduring mysteries in television history. For many fans, especially those who caught Happy Days in syndication years after it aired, stumbling upon early episodes with Chuck in them was like spotting a ghost, an unfamiliar figure in a familiar home, interacting with characters who would later act as if he had never existed. By the late 1980s, entertainment journalists had firmly embraced the term Chuck Cunningham syndrome to describe this kind of vanishing act. It started appearing in TV commentary, magazine articles, and even academic discussions about serialized storytelling. Whenever a sitcom character disappeared without explanation, whether it was Judy Winslow on Family Matters, Tina Pinciotti on That 70s Show, or even minor students on Saved by the Bell, critics reached back to Chuck as the definitive example. In fan communities, the mystery was kept alive through speculation and humor. Online message boards in the early internet days often included threads titled, "Where's Chuck?" or "Justice for Chuck Cunningham." Some fans crafted elaborate, tongue-in-cheek theories. Chuck joined the Witness Protection Program. Chuck became a basketball legend overseas. Chuck was trapped upstairs reading textbooks for a decade. The more ridiculous the theory, the more it played into the charm of the mystery. Television writers, too, could not resist referencing the phenomenon. Sitcoms like Scrubs and Arrested Development slipped in jokes about characters disappearing Chuck Cunningham style. Even Happy Days cast members leaned into the gag in interviews and reunions, with Henry Winkler's 2025 social media post, "He went upstairs and never came down," a mystery, serving as a perfect nod to decades of running jokes. What made the phenomenon so enduring was not just the oddity itself, but what it revealed about television storytelling. Chuck's disappearance proved that if a show is strong enough in other areas, be it character chemistry, humor, or cultural resonance, audiences will forgive, and sometimes even forget, glaring continuity gaps. It was a reminder that television is as much about perception as it is about strict narrative logic. Today, nearly 50 years after Chuck walked upstairs for the last time, his absence is still discussed in think pieces, nostalgia articles, and YouTube videos like this one. In a strange way, he has become far more famous for being erased than he ever was for existing on the show. His brief time on screen may have been forgettable, but his vanishing act became legendary.